Elena Voss had learned, long before she understood why, that the safest thing she could do was disappear. She learned it the way children learn to avoid a hot stove, through repetition and pain. In her pack, being an Omega was not treated as an honor. It was treated as a flaw, something to be managed and hidden, like a stain on the family name. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father, a proud man with a weak will, had spent the years since drowning his shame in card games and cheap whiskey. Elena grew up in the shadow of his disappointment, wearing herbal suppressants from the age of 12, so that no one outside their small house would ever catch her scent and know what she was. She did not resent the herbs, she resented what they meant. Every morning, she mixed the bitter paste and rubbed it against her wrists and throat, erasing herself a little more each day. By the time she was 20, she had almost forgotten what her own scent smelled like. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to walk into a room without shrinking first. Her father's debts finally caught up with him on a cold autumn evening. Two men came to the house, not to collect money, but to collect her. She listened through a thin wall as her father negotiated the price of his daughter, like she was a piece of furniture he no longer needed. She did not cry. She had trained herself, over many years, not to cry where anyone could hear. The men who took her were not cruel, not exactly. They were simply indifferent, which in some ways was worse. She was passed along a chain of hands until she arrived at the gates of Ashmere Castle, home of King Damon Ashworth, the Alpha King whose name alone made lesser packs tremble. She was not brought to him as a bride or a prisoner of war. She was brought as cheap labor, an unclaimed Omega with no pack to complain on her behalf, exactly the sort of quiet, invisible worker that great households always seem to need. The head steward looked her over with the same interest he might give a sack of grain. "Kitchen," he said. "Keep your head down. Keep your scent low. The king does not like distractions." Elena nodded. She was good at keeping her head down. She had been practicing her whole life. The months that followed blurred together in exhausting sameness. She rose before dawn to light the kitchen fires. She scrubbed pots until her hands cracked. She hauled water and firewood and carried heavy trays up flights of stairs. And at night, she slept in a narrow alcove behind the pantry, on a cot barely long enough for her body. The other kitchen staff were not unkind, but they were tired people with their own burdens, and no one had the energy to notice a quiet Omega girl who never spoke unless spoken to. She caught glimpses of the king sometimes, from a distance, across the courtyard, or through a half-open door. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and the kind of stillness that came from a man who had trained himself never to show weakness. The other servants spoke of him in hushed voices, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of careful respect, reserved for something powerful and slightly dangerous. They said he had never found his fated mate, that the bond every Alpha was supposed to feel had simply never come to him, no matter how many Omegas had been paraded through the castle over the years. They said the failure had hardened him, turned him into a king who ruled with his mind because his heart had never been given anything to hold on to. Elena did not think much about the king's personal sorrows. She had enough of her own to manage. Her small supply of suppressant herbs, smuggled from home in a cloth pouch, was running low, and she had no way to make more inside the castle walls. She rationed them carefully, applying less each week, hoping to stretch them until she could find some other solution. She told herself it would be fine. She told herself a lot of things to get through each day. The fire started on a windy night in early winter, in the east wing where old tapestries and dry wood had been stored for repairs. By the time the alarm bells rang, smoke was already curling thick and black through the servants' corridors. Elena woke coughing, her small alcove filling fast, and she grabbed nothing but her thin shawl before stumbling out into the chaos. Servants ran in every direction, shouting for water, for buckets, for the guards. Elena, disoriented and gasping, found herself pushed and jostled until she broke free of the crowd and stumbled out into the night air of the castle gardens. She fell to her knees on the cold grass, coughing until her lungs cleared, tears streaming down her face from the smoke, rather than sorrow, for once. It was only after several minutes, when her breathing steadied, that she realized her cloth pouch of suppressant herbs had been left behind in the fire. It was gone. There was nothing left to hide behind. She did not notice the change right away. It came on slowly, like a window opening after being painted shut for years. But somewhere in the garden, beneath the smoke and the cold air, her true scent began to rise, unhindered for the first time in over a decade. On the balcony above the garden, King Damon Ashworth had come outside to oversee the fire's containment, barking orders to his guards below. He was mid-sentence when it hit him. It was not a scent so much as a collision. One breath, and every wall he had built around himself in years of loneliness cracked at once. His knees nearly buckled against the stone railing. He had been told his entire adult life that he was incapable of the mate bond, that something in him was simply broken, unfit to ever feel what every other alpha felt. He had believed it, because believing it was easier than continuing to hope and continuing to be disappointed. And now, without warning, his body was screaming at him that it had all been a lie. He did not remember leaving the balcony. He remembered only the garden hedges tearing at his sleeves as he pushed through them, following a pull in his chest that felt like gravity itself had rearranged around one single point. He found her kneeling in the grass, soot on her face, her hair loose and tangled, looking up at him with the wide, frightened eyes of someone who expected to be punished simply for being noticed. "Who are you?" he said, though even as the words left him, they felt like the wrong question. It was not really a question, it was disbelief given sound. Elena's first instinct, honed by years of survival, was to make herself smaller. She dropped her gaze and began to rise. "I'm no one, Your Majesty. Kitchen staff. I'll return inside. I did not mean to be seen. You're my mate." The words came out of him raw, almost broken, as though he had not decided to say them at all. "You're my fated Luna." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena stared at him, certain she had misheard, certain this was some cruel trick of exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Kings did not claim kitchen servants as their fated mates. It did not happen. It was the kind of thing whispered about in old stories, not something that happened to girls who had been sold by their own fathers. But Damon was not looking at her like a servant. He was looking at her the way a drowning man looks at the surface of the water, with something between terror and relief. The following hours passed for Elena, in a haze she could barely process. Word spread through the castle faster than the fire itself had. The head steward, who had assigned her to scrubbing pots without a second glance, stood pale and stammering as the king himself dismissed him from his post. The kitchen staff, who had worked her past exhaustion, suddenly could not look her in the eye. Guards who had never once acknowledged her existence now bowed as she passed, and Elena, still smelling of smoke, still wearing her torn servant's dress, did not know where to put her hands or her eyes, or the strange, hollow disbelief sitting in her chest. She was brought to private chambers finer than anything she had ever stood inside, given warm water to wash the soot from her skin, and dressed in silks that felt foreign against her calloused hands. When she finally stood before a mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked for the first time in her life like someone who was allowed to take up space. Damon came to her that evening, alone, without his guards or advisors. He seemed almost nervous, which surprised her more than anything else that had happened that day. Kings, she had assumed, did not get nervous. "I owe you an explanation," he said, standing a respectful distance away. "And an apology, though I do not know yet for what, exactly. Only that you were brought into my household as property, and I did not know. That alone is a failure I intend to correct." Elena studied him carefully. She had spent her whole life reading the moods of powerful men, learning which words were safe and which were not. But there was no threat in his voice, only a kind of careful honesty that she did not know what to do with. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "The bond doesn't change that. I could be anyone." "You could be," he agreed. "I would like the chance to find out who you actually are, rather than assume the bond has already told me everything." It was, she would realize later, exactly the right thing to say. Not a declaration of love, which would have felt hollow and false after a single night. Not a demand that she simply accept her new role and be grateful for it. Just an offer, honestly made, to start from the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Damon kept his word in ways both large and small. He ordered an investigation into her father's debts, not to punish her further by dragging her past into the light, but to ensure the man could never sell another person again. He asked her opinions during small council meetings, not as a formality, but because he genuinely wanted to hear them, and adjusted his decisions more than once, based on what she said. When members of his court whispered that a former servant had no place advising a king, he made it clear, publicly and without hesitation, that Elena's voice carried weight in his household. It was not always easy. Elena had spent so many years making herself invisible that she did not know how to stop. The first time Daemon tried to make a decision on her behalf, believing he was protecting her, she found herself, to her own surprise, pushing back. She told him plainly that she had spent her entire life having choices made for her, and she would not trade one kind of ownership for another, even a gentler one. Daemon did not argue. He listened, apologized, and asked her what she wanted instead. It was such a small thing, being asked, but it undid something in her that years of suppressant herbs never could. Slowly, cautiously, Elena allowed herself to believe that this new life might actually be hers to shape. She learned the names of the kitchen staff who had once worked beside her and made sure their conditions improved. She spoke with the castle physician about her years of suppressant use, wanting to understand what it had cost her body, and found comfort in Daemon simply sitting beside her through the appointment, saying nothing, only present. The formal mating ceremony was held not in the grand throne room, as tradition demanded, but in the castle gardens, in the same spot where Daemon had found her weeks earlier. Elena had insisted on it, and Daemon had agreed without hesitation. She wanted to stand in the place where she had stopped hiding, not in some polished hall built for other people's history. She stood before the gathered court in her own scent, for the first time in her adult life. No herbs, no suppression, nothing hidden. Daemon stood beside her, and when it came time to speak, he did not offer the traditional words expected of a king claiming his Luna. Instead, he told the truth, plainly, in front of everyone who had once looked past her. "This kingdom overlooked her," he said, "the same way I once believed I was incapable of ever finding a mate at all. We were both wrong. She will not stand beside me as an ornament, and I will not rule as though her voice matters less than mine. She is my equal, my Luna, and the woman who taught me that being seen is not something anyone should have to earn." The court, whatever its private doubts, bowed as one. That night, long after the ceremony had ended, and the garden had emptied, Elena stood alone on the balcony where it had all begun, watching the first light of dawn creep over the castle walls. She thought of the girl who had once rubbed bitter herbs into her skin every morning, terrified of being known. That girl felt very far away now, though Elena carried her gently, the way one carries someone who survived something difficult. Daemon found her there, as he so often did now, and stood quietly beside her without a word, simply present, the way he had learned she needed him to be. Elena leaned into him, finally, fully, unafraid of being noticed. She was no longer someone's servant, sold and forgotten. She was Luna of Ashmere, seen at last, in the very place where the world had first learned her name.